She planted the tracker to find the truth. What she uncovered broke more than just their marriage. Marcus burst through the office door, his face twisted with rage and something that looked like pure terror. "What have you done?" His voice cracked on every word. "My exhibition is closing. The gallery just dropped me. Everyone is calling asking questions I can't answer. What the hell have you done to me?" Margot stood beside her mentor's desk, calmer than she'd ever been in 6 years of marriage. She looked at the man she'd loved, the man she'd built into something he'd never been, and spoke words that would destroy everything he thought he knew about his life. "I'm Katerina Voss. I've been Voss this whole time. Every door that opened for you, every opportunity you celebrated, every success you thought you earned. That was me. I built all of it. And now I've stopped building. And you're discovering what you actually are without my invisible support. Mediocre." The word landed like a bullet. Marcus staggered backward, his mouth opening and closing without sound, his entire reality crumbling in real time. That's where this story ends. But to understand how we got here, to understand how one woman's decision to plant a tracker in her husband's bag would reveal a betrayal so deep it would break more than just their marriage, we need to go back. Back to the beginning. Back to the moment Margot Rivera made the biggest mistake of her life. She fell in love with a man and decided her brilliance was too bright. So she dimmed it, and that decision almost destroyed her. If you've ever felt invisible in your own relationship, if you've ever made yourself smaller to make someone else feel bigger, if you've ever suspected something was wrong but convinced yourself you were just being paranoid, this story is for you. Stay with me, because what happens next will change how you see love, power, and the price women pay when they hide who they really are. And if this story resonates with you, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to Love Stories with Dr. Stone, because we're about to dive into a story about a woman who took her power back in the most spectacular way possible. This is a story about truth, betrayal, and what happens when the invisible woman finally steps into the light. Let's begin. The studio sat in darkness, the way it always did in the hours before dawn, when the world slept and Margot's true self could breathe without pretense. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city as an impressionist painting. Blurred lights against velvet darkness. Beautiful in its lack of definition. She stood before her latest canvas, brush hovering over colors that wouldn't cooperate, trying to translate emotion into visual language while her mind kept circling back to the same uncomfortable question. When had she become a stranger in her own life? On her desk sat 2 phones. One rose gold, bedazzled with a case her husband had bought her because he thought it suited her personality. That phone held messages from the book club she'd never wanted to join. Reminders about dry cleaning. Notifications from recipe apps she'd never downloaded. The other phone was matte black, password protected, completely unknown to anyone in her current life. That phone connected her to the identity she'd buried 6 years ago when she'd made the catastrophic mistake of confusing love with self-annihilation. Margot set down her brush and picked up the black phone. She scrolled through emails that addressed her by a name her husband had never heard. Dr. Katerina Voss, art historian, cultural critic, the anonymous voice behind the most influential column in the contemporary art world. The Voss Verdict, a weekly essay that could elevate an unknown artist to stardom or expose a celebrated fraud so thoroughly that galleries would remove their work before the column even finished trending. She'd been writing the column for 12 years. Since her doctoral thesis on authenticity and attribution in contemporary art had quietly revolutionized how museums approached acquisitions. Her academic work appeared under her maiden name, Rivera, in journals only specialists read. But Katerina Voss belonged to everyone and no one, a specter who shaped taste, who directed millions in arts funding with a single published opinion, who maintained such complete anonymity that even her editor at the Arts Review had never seen her face. All business conducted through encrypted emails and a voice modulator for the rare phone call. The irony of her situation would have been funny if it weren't so desperately sad. She'd become invisible by choice in her professional life to maintain the power that came with objective anonymity. Then she'd made herself invisible in her personal life out of something she'd convinced herself was love, but was beginning to suspect had always been cowardice dressed in romantic delusion. Margot's gaze drifted to the photograph on her desk. The one artifact she'd allowed herself from her former life. In it, she stood at a gallery opening in Paris 7 years ago, accepting the prestigious Beaumont Prize for her critical essay on digital art and the commodification of authenticity. She wore a black dress that made her feel powerful. Her hair swept back to reveal a face that radiated confidence and intellectual certainty. She'd been 31, brilliant, absolutely certain of her place in the world. That was 3 months before she'd met Marcus at a coffee shop in the museum district. The memory pulled her backward through time to a rainy Thursday afternoon when she'd been writing notes for her next Voss column. Surrounded by art books and empty espresso cups, Marcus had appeared beside her table, rain-soaked and apologetic, asking if she'd mind sharing the outlet because his laptop was dying and he desperately needed to finish formatting his gallery exhibition proposal before the submission deadline. She'd said yes, and they'd fallen into conversation the way strangers do when forced into proximity, tentative at first, then warming as they'd discovered shared passions. He was an artist, a painter working in what he described as emotional realism, trying to capture psychological states through portraiture. She'd been careful not to reveal too much, had introduced herself simply as Margot, an art lover who worked as a private consultant for collectors. Looking back now, she could see the exact moment she should have been honest. When he'd shown her his portfolio on his laptop, and she'd recognized immediately that his technical skill was solid, but his conceptual depth was severely limited. He painted beautiful surfaces with nothing beneath them, the kind of work that sold well to corporate offices and upscale hotels but would never be taken seriously by the critical establishment she moved through like a ghost. She should have told him then, "I'm Dr. Katharina Voss. I'm the person who could make or break your career with 400 carefully chosen words. And what you're creating is visually appealing but intellectually empty." Instead, she'd smiled and said his work was lovely, had let him buy her dinner, had agreed to see him again because there was something intoxicating about being wanted by someone who didn't know she could destroy his professional aspirations with a single column. For once, someone looked at her and saw just Margot. Not the credentials, not the reputation, not the power. Just a woman who laughed at his jokes and didn't mind when he talked too long about his artistic vision. Their courtship had been brief and intense, filled with museum visits where she'd carefully modulated her expertise, gallery openings where she'd stood in corners while he networked with curators who would have salivated over access to Katharina Voss. He'd proposed after 6 months, in front of a mural he'd painted on an abandoned building. A gesture she'd found romantic despite the little voice in her head reminding her that unsanctioned public art was more often vandalism than visionary. Her mentor, Dr. Harrison Webb, had attended the wedding with profound reservations carved into every line of his weathered face. Harrison had been the first person to recognize her analytical brilliance, had guided her dissertation, had helped her establish the Katharina Voss pseudonym, had managed her column's publication for over a decade. After the ceremony, while guests celebrated with champagne she'd purchased with royalties from her books, Harrison had pulled her aside into the museum garden where the reception was being held. Intelligence makes fools of the wisest women when they're desperate to be loved for something other than their minds. His voice had been heavy with concern that came from genuine affection. "You're hiding your light under a bushel basket, Margot. But baskets are flammable, and eventually there's always a spark. Marcus is different." She'd insisted, wanting desperately to believe it. "He loves me for who I am, not what I've accomplished. There's freedom in being seen as just myself." Harrison had studied her with the same intense focus he brought to examining potentially fraudulent attributions. "But this isn't yourself, my dear. This is a carefully edited version. A palimpsest with all your most important text scraped away." What happens when he realizes there were layers beneath what he's been reading? She'd laughed off his concerns, convinced that love meant creating space for Marcus's confidence, that marriage required one person to hold the spotlight while the other managed the lighting from backstage. She'd been so certain that his ego was fragile, that revealing her true stature in their shared world would make him feel diminished, that protecting his sense of masculine achievement was part of her wifely duty. Harrison's warning had proven prophetic in ways she'd been too naive to imagine. The early days of their marriage had glowed with the kind of simple happiness that required nothing but proximity and mutual affection. They'd lived in a modest loft Marcus could barely afford. Except she'd secretly purchased the building through a shell corporation and arranged for him to get a suspiciously good lease. Though he'd attributed the deal to his own negotiating skills. He would paint in the converted living room while she pretended to work on her consulting in their bedroom, actually writing essays that would appear under Katerina Voss's byline and shape conversations in art institutions globally. When Marcus's first major gallery opportunity appeared, a group show at the prestigious Meridian Gallery, Margot had quietly arranged the entire thing. She'd called in a favor from the gallery director, a woman who'd once offered Katerina Voss an exclusive touring exhibition of her private collection in exchange for a positive column mention. Margot had spent 2 hours on the phone explaining why Marcus's work, while not critically groundbreaking, had the kind of accessible appeal that would bring new audiences into contemporary art spaces and generate sales that could fund more experimental projects. Marcus had celebrated his acceptance into the show with champagne and victory, convinced that his talent had finally been recognized on its own obvious merits. She'd kissed him and agreed enthusiastically, never mentioning the conversation that had actually secured his spot in an exhibition where every other artist had extensive critical pedigree and museum acquisitions. That became her pattern, the invisible architecture of their marriage. Marcus would dream these artistic dreams, and Margot would build the scaffolding that made dreams transform into tangible reality, all while ensuring he never noticed the construction she'd done behind every door he walked through. Her mentor Harrison had witnessed this dynamic during quarterly meetings where they'd discuss her Voss column and academic work, always in his university office where Marcus would never accidentally discover them. "You're building him a career and signing it with his name alone," Harrison had said repeatedly, concern deepening with each meeting. What happens when he believes the myth? When he's convinced himself that everything came through his own merit? Margot had deflected, had changed subjects, had told herself that partnership meant different roles, that her fulfillment came from seeing Marcus succeed, that love required sacrifice. She'd been managing a professional reputation that influenced hundreds of millions in arts funding, writing books under her maiden name that redefined critical theory, shaping cultural conversations that reached far beyond anything Marcus would achieve in 10 lifetimes. Yet she'd chosen to be known simply as Marcus's wife, the supportive woman who attended his openings and smiled pleasantly when people forgot to ask what she did beyond existing as his attractive accessory. The devotion had been absolute and increasingly self-destructive. When Marcus had fallen into a deep depression after a mixed review in a local arts paper, a review that had praised his technical skill while noting the lack of conceptual depth, which Margot had immediately recognized as fair and accurate criticism, she'd canceled a lecture at the Sorbonne to sit beside him for 5 days, feeding him soup, reading him positive comments from social media, convincing him that one critic's opinion meant nothing. Harrison had called repeatedly about time-sensitive decisions regarding a museum acquisition that required Katerina Voss's expertise. But Margot had silenced her phone and chosen Marcus's fragile ego over her professional responsibilities. Because that's what good wives did, she'd told herself. They put their husbands first, even when those husbands were treating legitimate criticism as personal betrayal rather than professional feedback. Marcus had recovered and thanked her sweetly, holding her close and murmuring that he didn't know what he'd do without her support. But even then, even in that moment of supposed gratitude, she'd noticed something shift when she tried to discuss the review's valid points and suggest ways he might deepen his conceptual approach. He'd patted her hand with barely concealed condescension and suggested she didn't really understand the higher levels of artistic discourse, that these were complex theoretical matters beyond her consulting expertise. The dismissal had stung, sharp and unexpected, but she told herself he was still recovering, still fragile, still finding his footing. The dismissals continued, grew more frequent, more casual in their cruelty. When the Turner Contemporary Museum had offered Marcus a solo exhibition, an opportunity Margot had orchestrated through a conversation with the curator, a former student of Harrison's who trusted Katerina Voss's judgment implicitly, Marcus had celebrated as if his genius had finally received inevitable recognition. Margot had stood in their kitchen, remembering the dinner she'd arranged. The careful conversation where she'd positioned Marcus's accessible style as exactly what the museum needed to broaden their audience demographics and increase attendance from the suburban demographic their board was desperately trying to court. She'd arranged everything while making it appear organic, inevitable, merit-based, and Marcus never knew that his greatest triumph had required her invisible intervention. Her professional reputation leveraged on his behalf. Her credibility spent like currency to purchase his validation. She told herself that partnership meant different roles, that her power was in supporting his success while maintaining her own separate professional identity that he'd never need to know about. But the lie was becoming harder to sustain, the cognitive dissonance more painful with each passing month. The memory of his first real cruelty remained sharp as broken glass, cutting her every time her mind touched it. They'd been at dinner discussing a challenge he was facing with his studio practice, specifically how to price his work now that he had museum representation. Margot had offered a suggestion based on her extensive knowledge of art market economics, research she'd conducted for a Voss column on valuation and artificial scarcity. Marcus had set down his wine glass and looked at her with something cold flickering behind his eyes. You wouldn't understand how these things actually work in professional art markets. His tone had been pleasant but utterly dismissive. These are complex economic and theoretical considerations. Maybe we should just talk about something else. Something more in your wheelhouse. She'd felt something crack inside her chest. A hairline fracture in the foundation of everything she'd believed about their marriage. But she'd smiled and changed the subject. Had suggested they discuss the gallery opening they'd be attending that weekend. Had swallowed the truth about who she actually was and what she actually knew about art markets. Because revealing it would mean admitting she'd been lying through omission for their entire relationship. She'd been wrong about so many things. But most of all, she'd been wrong about whether the truth would eventually matter less than the love she'd thought they were building. Now, standing in her studio in the hours before dawn, Margot touched the photograph of her former self, Dr. Katharina Voss, confident and powerful and visible, and wondered when she'd made the decision to trade her identity for a marriage that was slowly killing everything she'd built before Marcus had asked her to share an electrical outlet. Her mentor had been right about keeping cards hidden. He just hadn't warned her what happened when you hid them so thoroughly that you forgot what hand you'd been dealt, or when the game had shifted from poker to Russian roulette with your own sense of self loaded in the chamber. The charity gala glittered with exactly the kind of wealth that whispered its presence rather than shouting. Designer gowns that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. Jewelry that belonged in museum vaults. Champagne that tasted like liquidified pretension. Margot had attended because Marcus insisted, wearing a dress she'd chosen carefully to be elegant without drawing attention. Still playing the role of supportive wife rather than the woman whose anonymous column had convinced half the attendees which artists to collect and which exhibitions deserved their charitable donations. She'd been standing near the silent auction, examining a photograph she'd privately convinced the artist to donate through her Katharina Voss identity, when she'd spotted Marcus across the ballroom. He hadn't mentioned attending tonight. She'd asked him at breakfast if he'd wanted to accompany her, and he'd claimed exhaustion from preparing for his upcoming exhibition. Said he needed a quiet evening at home to recharge his creative energy. Yet there he stood, laughing with a group of gallery directors and collectors, his hand gesturing animatedly as he held court, his eyes scanning the room with the particular hunger of someone networking rather than enjoying themselves. His gaze swept over her without pause, continuing past as if she were wallpaper, or perhaps a waiter carrying a tray he didn't currently need. The impact of his non-recognition hit her like a physical blow. She'd chosen her dress carefully tonight, a deep sapphire that her mother had always said made her skin luminous and brought out the warmth in her dark eyes. She'd styled her hair the way Marcus once claimed made him catch his breath, swept to one side with small pearls woven through the dark waves. She'd come to this event specifically because she knew the foundation's director would be here. knew she needed to have a quiet conversation that would ensure Marcus's application for their emerging artist grant would receive favorable consideration despite his limited critical recognition. But Marcus had looked at her and seen nothing worth acknowledging. Not even a polite nod across a crowded room. She watched him network for another hour. Observing the way he commanded attention with confidence she'd helped build through years of strategic support behind every success. When their paths finally crossed near the bar, where people clustered to refresh their drinks and their social energy, she'd smiled and touched his arm gently. "I didn't know you'd changed your mind about attending." Her voice stayed light despite the hurt blooming beneath her ribs. Marcus glanced at her hand on his sleeve like it was something distasteful that needed removal. "I ran into Marcus Delacroix. He mentioned several major collectors would be here. Seemed like an opportunity one couldn't pass up." He looked past her shoulder, already scanning for his next conversation, dismissing her presence before she could respond. "Will you introduce me?" Margot gestured toward the group he'd been speaking with earlier. "I'd like to meet the people you're working with." His expression shifted into something almost cruel, a flash of irritation crossing his handsome features. "These are conversations about complex artistic theories and market positioning. You'd probably find them boring beyond comprehension. Sweetheart, why don't you enjoy the appetizers or something?" Then he walked away without waiting for her response, leaving her standing alone beside the bar while couples swirled past on the dance floor. People laughed at jokes she couldn't hear over the ringing in her ears. Margot excused herself shortly after, slipping into the cool night air where the sounds of the gala became muted and her breathing could return to something approaching normal. She stood beneath the building's overhang while light rain began to fall, wondering when she'd become so worthless in the eyes of the man who'd once proposed to her with shaking hands and promises about partnership. Harrison found her there 20 minutes later, took one look at her face and understood immediately what had happened. "He's here, isn't he?" His voice was quiet, fury simmering beneath his careful control. "Marcus." She nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. Harrison offered his arm with old-fashioned courtesy, walked her to his car, drove her to an all-night diner far from the glittering gala and its painful memories. Over coffee that was terrible but honest, served in chipped mugs by a weary waitress who looked like she understood disappointment intimately. He listened while Margot tried to explain away Marcus's behavior. "You're making excuses for someone who doesn't deserve them," Harrison said finally, his voice gentle but carrying the weight of years watching this slow-motion disaster unfold. "I've watched you build everything he has. I've seen you sacrifice professional opportunities to solve his problems. I've witnessed you making yourself invisible so he could feel important. And tonight he looked through you like you didn't exist. When are you going to stop protecting him from the consequences of treating you like you're worthless?" Margot stirred sugar into her coffee, watching the crystals dissolve into darkness. "He's under tremendous pressure with the exhibition coming up. Success changes people temporarily. The man I married is still there underneath all this." "Is he?" Harrison reached across the table and covered her hand with his weathered one. "Or is this who he's always been? And you just kept making allowances until the allowances became your entire existence?" She had no answer for that question. So they sat in silence while the diner's neon sign buzzed overhead, and truck drivers came and went, living lives that seemed simpler than hers despite their own hardships. The pattern continued deteriorating like a building slowly crumbling from foundation rot. Marcus's greatest crisis arrived when his primary gallery representation suddenly dropped him, citing creative differences and evolving brand identity. The loss threatened to derail his upcoming exhibition, destroy his momentum, leave him without the commercial support that made full-time artistry possible. Margot spent 3 sleepless nights working her network, or rather Katerina Voss's network, calling in favors from gallery directors who owed her for positive column mentions, arranging for a better gallery to represent him, one with more prestige and stronger collector relationships. She orchestrated the entire rescue so seamlessly that Marcus believed it was his own portfolio and reputation that had attracted the new representation. He came home triumphant, opened expensive wine she'd stocked specifically because she knew this moment would arrive. toasted his own resilience and artistic merit with colleagues he'd invited over to celebrate. Margot raised her glass and smiled while Harrison's words echoed in her memory, asking what she'd expected from a man who'd never had to acknowledge the hands that lifted him higher every day. Her mother called during those difficult days, some maternal instinct telling her that Margot needed support. They met for lunch at a restaurant near the university where Margot's mother taught literature, discussing 19th-century novels to graduate students who would never know that Professor Rivera's daughter was the most influential art critic of their generation. Over soup and sandwiches, Margot's mother studied her daughter's face with the kind of perception that came from surviving her own marriage to a man who'd wanted a decorative wife rather than an intellectual equal. "You have that look," her mother said with certainty, "the look of a woman convincing herself that giving everything means she'll eventually receive something back. Marcus is a good man underneath all this." Margot insisted, needing to believe it. "He's just lost his way temporarily with all the success and pressure." Her mother set down her spoon with deliberate care. "Darling, I taught you to be brilliant. I showed you that women could build legacies while men slept. But I forgot to teach you that some people will mistake your strength for a resource to be mined rather than a gift to be treasured. A man who forgets where his opportunities came from will eventually convince himself he was born deserving them, that he earned them through talent rather than through someone else's invisible labor." The words settled into Margot's bones with uncomfortable accuracy, but she changed the subject to lighter topics, unwilling to admit that her marriage might be dying while she still believed in resurrection. Marcus started bringing colleagues home without warning, expecting Margot to produce hospitality on demand regardless of her own schedule or work. She became skilled at creating elegant dinners from whatever was available, at playing hostess while being treated like hired help rather than the woman who lived there. One evening, 8 people arrived with Marcus without any advance notice. Margot had been writing a Voss column on emerging artists in digital media, a piece that would be read by museum curators globally and shape acquisition decisions for the next year. But she closed her laptop and transformed their kitchen into a catering operation, producing courses that would have impressed restaurant critics. She served wine with perfect pairings, ensured everyone's comfort with attentive care. And when she tried to join the conversation about artistic authenticity in the age of AI, a topic she'd literally written her dissertation on, Marcus looked at her with barely concealed irritation. "Sweetheart, maybe you'd be more comfortable checking on dessert?" His tone was pleasant on the surface, but the dismissal was absolute. She retreated to the kitchen while his colleagues discussed art theory in the other room, topics she understood better than anyone at that table. And she felt herself becoming a ghost in her own home. Later, after everyone had left and the house was quiet, she tried to talk to Marcus about respect, about partnership, about remembering they were supposed to be building a life together. He accused her of being dramatic and needy, claimed he was exhausted from entertaining and didn't need her creating problems out of nothing. Margot went to bed alone that night while Marcus stayed up reviewing his exhibition plans. She lay in darkness, pulling out their wedding album from the nightstand drawer. The photographer had captured the moment when Marcus looked at her during their vows, his expression full of wonder and promise and what she believed was genuine love that would last forever. She traced his face in that photograph with trembling fingers, searching for any remnant of the man who'd gazed at her with such seeming reverence. She fell asleep with the album open across her chest, and when Marcus finally came to bed hours later, he hadn't noticed it lying there between them. Another invisible thing in the growing collection of everything he'd stopped seeing about the woman who'd built his world. If you're recognizing yourself in Margot's story right now, drop a comment below telling me this. Have you ever made yourself smaller for someone else's ego? You're not alone. And if this story is hitting home, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because what's coming next will show you why staying silent and invisible will destroy you faster than any betrayal ever could. Marcus's schedule became erratic. Late nights, password-protected phone, text messages that said "still at studio, productive session." Margot told herself she was being paranoid, that successful artists kept irregular hours, that privacy didn't equal secrecy. But her professional instincts, the ones that had made her Katharina Voss, the ones that saw through fraudulent attribution and artistic pretension. Those instincts screamed that something was wrong. Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Pattern emerged. Marcus would leave after dinner, claim he was going to his studio, wouldn't return until after midnight. Sometimes later, he'd slip into bed beside her with fabricated stories about inspiration striking, about losing track of time, about conversations with other artists at the studio building that supposedly stayed open late. Margot lay awake those nights, listening to him breathe, wondering when her husband had become a stranger, wondering if he'd always been a stranger and she'd just been too in love with the idea of being loved to notice. The internal debate consumed her. Investigate or trust? Demand answers or maintain the illusion of marital harmony? Every professional instinct told her to gather evidence before making accusations. But every part of her that still believed in their marriage recoiled from the idea of surveillance, from violating his privacy, from becoming the suspicious wife. She'd built a career on seeing what others missed. But when it came to her own life, she'd been desperately blind. Harrison noticed during their next quarterly meeting. They sat in his university office. Gallery catalogs and exhibition reviews spread between them, discussing her latest Voss column on institutional gatekeeping in contemporary art. But Margot's mind kept drifting, her responses distracted, her usual analytical sharpness dulled by exhaustion and anxiety. What's wrong? Harrison set down the document he'd been reviewing, his weathered face creased with concern. And don't tell me nothing. I've known you for 15 years. I can tell when something is eating at you. Margot tried to deflect, to insist she was just tired, that the column deadline had been particularly challenging. But Harrison's patient silence eventually broke through her resistance. I think Marcus is having an affair. The words emerged quietly, almost a whisper, as if speaking them too loudly would make them more real. Harrison's expression shifted. Not surprise. Something closer to resigned confirmation. I've heard rumors. His voice was gentle, reluctant, not wanting to be right about this, about Marcus and a young artist. I didn't want to mention it without proof. Didn't want to hurt you based on gossip. Who? Margot's voice was steady, but her hands trembled in her lap. Sienna Castellanos. Harrison watched her carefully. The emerging artist whose debut you praised in your column 3 months ago. People have seen them together. At galleries. At restaurants. The kind of together that doesn't look professional. The name hit Margot like ice water. Sienna Castellanos. 26 years old. Genuinely talented in ways Marcus wasn't. Margot had written enthusiastically about her work. Had recognized authentic conceptual depth and technical innovation. Had used her Katarina Voss platform to elevate a deserving artist. And now Marcus was sleeping with her. The irony was so sharp it drew blood. You need to know the truth. Harrison leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of difficult necessity. Not rumors, not speculation. Truth. Hard evidence that will let you make an informed decision about your marriage. He pulled a small device from his desk drawer. A GPS tracker, state-of-the-art, paired with an app that would show location in real time. I don't want to invade his privacy. Margot stared at the device like it was a bomb. If I do this, if I cross this line, there's no going back. You've already lost, Margot. Harrison's voice was firm, compassionate. You lost yourself 6 years ago when you decided his ego was more important than your truth. Now you're just deciding whether to keep living the lie. Whether to keep making yourself invisible while he builds a life with someone else. The tracker sat between them on the desk. Small, innocuous, capable of revealing truths Margot wasn't sure she wanted confirmed. If I look and find nothing, I'm just paranoid, she said quietly. But if I look and find something, then everything I've believed about my marriage is a lie. Either way, I lose. Either way, you know. Harrison replied. And knowing is always better than this slow poison of suspicion. This daily erosion of your sanity and self-worth. You deserve truth. Even if the truth destroys everything. Margot took the tracker. Its weight in her palm felt heavier than such a small device should. The weight of decision, of action, of finally refusing to be blind. Tuesday morning. Marcus in the shower. Margot's hands shaking as she slipped the device into the inner pocket of his messenger bag, the bag he carried everywhere. Her reflection in the bedroom mirror showed a woman she barely recognized. When had she become this person? When had love turned into surveillance? When had marriage become a crime scene requiring evidence collection? Marcus emerged from the bathroom, kissed her goodbye, completely unaware, and Margot felt guilt coat her throat like oil. But underneath the guilt was something harder. The growing certainty that she was about to discover something that would change everything. That would finally force her to see what she'd been refusing to acknowledge. After he left, she activated the tracking app. A blue dot appeared on the city map, moving through familiar streets toward his studio in the arts district. Normal. Expected. Innocent. The first week revealed nothing particularly damning. Studio visits, gallery meetings, coffee shops where Marcus presumably sketched and contemplated his artistic vision. Margot almost convinced herself that her suspicions were paranoid delusions, manifestations of her own guilt about hiding her identity rather than reflections of his actual behavior. Relief mixed with shame. Maybe she was destroying her marriage over nothing. Maybe the late nights were exactly what he claimed. Maybe she was the problem. Too paranoid, too insecure, too damaged by her own deception to trust her husband's honesty. Then came Thursday evening, day 7 of surveillance. The blue dot moved through the city along its usual route, then diverged, heading to an address in the arts district that wasn't his studio, wasn't any gallery she recognized. The dot stopped and stayed. Margot sat in her home office, watching that stationary dot on her screen while her Voss column deadline approached and words refused to form. She told herself there were innocent explanations. A private collector's residence. A potential patron's loft. Any number of professional reasons for Marcus to be at an unfamiliar address for an extended period. 3:47 p.m. The dot stayed. 5:23 p.m. Still there. 7:15 p.m. Hadn't moved. 9:42 p.m. The dot remained stationary while Margot's world narrowed to that blinking point of light on her screen, and she couldn't breathe. She cross-referenced the address through property records, a skill she'd developed years ago for researching art collectors and their holdings. The apartment belonged to Sienna Castellanos, the 26-year-old emerging artist whose recent gallery debut Margot had praised in her Voss column. The young woman Harrison had mentioned. The woman people had seen with Marcus at galleries and restaurants. The kind of together that doesn't look professional. Marcus was at Sienna's apartment. Had been there for over 6 hours. While texting Margot that he was working late at his studio. While lying with the casual ease of someone who'd done it before. Many times before. The evidence accumulated like a prosecutor building a case. Tuesday and Thursday evenings. The same pattern. The blue dot settling at Sienna's address. Staying for hours. Sometimes Marcus wouldn't return home until after midnight. Once not until 3 a.m. Always with the same fabricated stories about productive painting sessions. About losing track of time. About the artistic process demanding attention. Margot cataloged every lie. Every text message claiming he was at the studio when the tracker showed him at Sienna's apartment. Every casual kiss goodnight that tasted like betrayal. Every morning when he'd leave with his messenger bag, completely unaware that the device hidden in the inner pocket was documenting his systematic deception. She said nothing, continued playing her role with mechanical precision. Made dinners Marcus sometimes ate and sometimes skipped. Attended gallery events where he introduced everyone except her. Smiled when he talked about his upcoming exhibition. The exhibition she'd arranged. At the museum she'd convinced to take a chance on an artist with limited critical recognition. The irony would have been funny if it weren't slowly killing her. The exhibition opening arrived. Turner Contemporary Museum. Marcus's paintings on pristine white walls. Champagne. Well-dressed crowd. Celebration of an artist whose career existed because his wife had built it while hiding who she was. Margot attended wearing a dress that cost more than Marcus knew. That she'd purchased with royalties from her books. books published under her maiden name. Books Marcus had never read because he'd never bothered to learn what she did beyond existing as his supportive wife. She stood in corners, watching him accept congratulations, watching him bask in validation he hadn't earned, watching him introduce collectors and curators to his artistic vision with the confidence she'd built through years of invisible support. And then she saw her, Sienna, young and beautiful in a black dress that made her look sophisticated beyond her years. Her work had genuine merit. Margot hadn't lied in her Voss column. The girl had talent, real conceptual depth that Marcus would never achieve. Was that part of the appeal? Did Marcus see in Sienna what he'd never bothered to look for in Margot? Intelligence, artistic understanding, someone who could actually engage with the theoretical discourse he claimed to value. The thought was acid in her throat. Marcus introduced Sienna to collectors, his hand resting on the small of her back. Casual, intimate, the kind of touch that spoke of familiarity, of private knowledge, of touching that had happened before and would happen again. This is Sienna Castellanos. Marcus's voice carried across the gallery. Incredibly talented emerging artist. I've been mentoring her. She's going to be huge. Mentoring. The word was poison disguised as professional development. Margot watched his hand on Sienna's back. Watched the girl lean into his touch. Watched her husband perform intimacy with another woman in a gallery full of people who didn't know Margot existed beyond being the quiet wife in the corner. She pulled out her phone. Sent a text to Harrison. I need to see you. Tomorrow. It's time. His response was immediate. My office. 9 a.m. I'm sorry, Margot. She left the exhibition before it ended. Walked out into cold night air that shocked her system back into something approaching clarity. She'd been living in fog for 6 years, making herself invisible, hiding her brilliance, building a man who didn't deserve building. And while she'd been constructing his career with invisible labor, he'd been constructing a life with someone else. The truth was confirmed. The betrayal was documented. And Margot was done being invisible. This is the moment where everything changes. If you're invested in Margot's story, show me by hitting that subscribe button. Drop a comment and tell me this. Would you plant the tracker? Or would you keep hoping you were wrong? Because what Margot does next will show you what real power looks like when an invisible woman finally steps into the light. Sunday morning. Winter light filtered through their loft windows with cruel clarity, illuminating everything in harsh detail that left no shadows for hiding. Margot had stayed up all night preparing, assembling printed records of the tracker's data. Screenshots of Sienna's social media posts that showed Marcus in the background of photos taken inside her apartment. Casual evidence of a relationship that had clearly progressed beyond professional mentorship. The evidence spread across their kitchen table told a story. Tuesday and Thursday evenings for 6 months. Hours at Sienna's apartment while text messages claimed studio sessions. The timeline of systematic lying laid out in timestamps and GPS coordinates. Undeniable, irrefutable, the kind of evidence that left no room for gaslighting or manipulation. Marcus emerged from their bedroom around 10, stretching and yawning, completely comfortable in his deception. Morning, babe. Any coffee left? We need to talk. Margot's voice was steady despite the chaos churning inside her chest. Something in her tone registered. Marcus's casual expression shifted into wariness. About what? She slid the printed evidence across their kitchen table. Watched his face as he processed what he was seeing. The tracker data showing repeated visits to an address that wasn't his studio. The photographs showing him in Sienna's apartment. The timeline revealing months of systematic lying about his whereabouts and activities. What is this? Marcus's voice carried guilt rather than genuine confusion. Have you been tracking me? What the hell, Margot? That's insane. That's invasive and controlling and completely unacceptable behavior. Don't. She interrupted, her voice sharp as breaking glass. Don't you dare try to make this about my methods when we both know what I found. How long, Marcus? How long have you been sleeping with her? He tried to deny it at first. Claimed Sienna was just a fellow artist he was mentoring. That the visits were professional. That Margot was misinterpreting innocent interactions. That she was being paranoid and creating problems where none existed. But the lies crumbled quickly under the weight of evidence. GPS data doesn't lie. Timestamps don't misinterpret. And eventually he stopped trying to maintain the fiction. 6 months. His voice carried defiance rather than remorse. It just happened, Margot. These things happen in creative relationships. You've been so distant lately. So preoccupied with whatever you do all day while I'm actually working. Sienna understands me as an artist. She sees my vision. She gets what I'm trying to accomplish in ways you never have. The casual cruelty of it stole her breath. She'd been distant because she'd been writing essays that shaped global art discourse while pretending to be his supportive wife. She'd been preoccupied because she'd been managing a professional reputation that dwarfed anything Marcus would achieve in 10 lifetimes. All while arranging every opportunity he'd celebrated as evidence of his own talent. She's half your age, Margot said quietly, and you're her mentor. That's not romance, Marcus. That's predatory power dynamics disguised as artistic collaboration. She's 26, not 16. Marcus snapped back. She's an adult making her own choices. And unlike you, she actually respects my artistic voice instead of always being so quiet and agreeable about everything. She challenges me intellectually. She inspires me in ways you stopped inspiring me years ago. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so devastating. Marcus wanted someone who challenged him, who engaged with his art intellectually, while he'd spent 6 years dismissing every opinion Margot offered, telling her she didn't understand complex artistic discourse, treating her insights like background noise from someone whose thoughts didn't matter. I want you to leave, Margot said, each word costing her something essential. Pack your things and get out. We're done. Marcus's expression shifted into something uglier. The mask finally slipping completely. This is my loft. I've been living here for 8 years. You don't get to kick me out of my own home just because you're upset about my personal relationships. Actually, I do. Margot replied with cold precision. Because I own this building. I've owned it for 9 years. I arranged for you to get a lease here through a property management company I control. This has been my building the entire time we've known each other. She watched the information land. Watched confusion cross his features as he tried to process what she was telling him. Watched his certainty about his reality begin to crack like ice under pressure. What are you talking about? Marcus's voice rose. You don't own anything. You're a consultant. You work from home doing whatever vague administrative work you do for collectors. You don't have the resources to own buildings. No, Marcus, Margot said, feeling pieces of her hidden identity clicking back into place like armor she'd forgotten she owned. That's what I let you believe. What I actually do is considerably more significant than you've ever bothered to learn. But you never asked, did you? In 6 years of marriage, you never once asked me about my work. About what I did during the days while you were painting. About where the money came from that paid for the wine you served your colleagues. The gallery openings we attended. The comfortable life you enjoyed. You just assumed I was doing something small and insignificant. Something that didn't matter compared to your important artistic pursuits. Marcus stared at her like she was speaking a foreign language. Like the woman standing before him was someone he'd never seen before. He hadn't. He'd been married to a stranger. To a carefully constructed performance. To a woman who'd made herself invisible so he could feel visible. Get out. Margot's voice was steel. You have until tonight to pack your things. After that, the locks will be changed and your belongings will be in storage. You can collect them when you've found somewhere else to live. You can't do this. Marcus's voice cracked. You can't just throw me out. We're married. We have legal agreements. You can't unilaterally decide to end our marriage and force me out of my home. Watch me. Margot pulled her phone from her pocket. Made a call that Marcus couldn't hear clearly. Spoke in quiet tones that carried absolute authority. When she ended the call, she looked at him with eyes that held no love, no anger, just cold finality. My lawyer will contact you tomorrow about divorce proceedings. I suggest you get your own representation. You're going to need it. Marcus stood in their kitchen, surrounded by evidence of his betrayal. facing a woman he'd never bothered to know. And for the first time in 6 years, he looked genuinely afraid. "Who are you?" "Someone you never bothered to find out," Margot replied. "And that's the real tragedy of this marriage, Marcus. Not that you cheated. Not that you lied. But that you spent 6 years living with someone and never once wondered who she really was." Harrison was waiting in his office when Margot arrived Monday morning. His face already set in the expression of someone prepared to execute a long overdue plan. He stood when she entered, studied her face with the careful attention he'd always brought to her work, her life, her well-being. "Tell me what you need," he said without preamble. "How far do you want to take this?" Margot considered the question carefully while watching snow fall outside Harrison's window, covering the university campus in white that looked pure until you examined it closely and saw the dirt underneath. She thought about mercy, about proportional response, about being the bigger person and taking the high road, about all the things women were told they should do when men treated them badly. Then she thought about 6 years of making herself invisible, about systematic dismissal, about Marcus touching another woman while benefiting from opportunities Margot had arranged, about being treated like she understood nothing while she shaped the discourse he moved through like a ghost. "I want him to understand exactly who I am," she said finally. "I want everyone to understand. I'm done hiding Harrison. I'm done protecting his ego. I'm done being invisible. It's time for Katerina Voss to step into the light." Harrison nodded once, unsurprised. He pulled out a folder he'd apparently been preparing for months, waiting for this moment. "Then let's show them who you really are." The plan unfolded with the precision of a military operation. First, Harrison contacted the Arts Review and arranged for a profile piece on Katerina Voss. The first time the anonymous critic had ever agreed to be photographed or interviewed publicly. The magazine was ecstatic. Cleared their next cover for the exclusive revelation of the art world's most influential ghost. Second, Harrison reached out to every gallery director, museum curator, and collector who owed Katerina Voss favors, which was essentially everyone of significance in the contemporary art world. He made it known through careful conversations that Dr. Voss's anonymity had been protecting certain artists from conflicts of interest. But that situation had changed. Artists who'd received representation or opportunities through her invisible intervention might find their circumstances reevaluated now that the full truth was emerging. Third, and most devastating, Harrison contacted the Turner Contemporary Museum and provided them with documentation, showing that Marcus's entire exhibition had been arranged through Katerina Voss's recommendation, that his gallery representation had been secured through her intervention, that virtually every significant opportunity in his career could be traced back to her invisible support, that the artist they were currently celebrating had achieved his position through borrowed legitimacy rather than earned merit. The museum was horrified to discover they'd been unknowingly manipulated, even if the manipulation had been intended to support an artist rather than deceive the institution. Their response was swift and brutal, the kind of institutional rejection that ended careers permanently. But the true core of Margot's plan was the column, the final Voss verdict that would publish the same week the profile appeared, revealing her identity while simultaneously reassessing every artist she'd ever privately supported, including her soon-to-be ex-husband. She wrote it over 3 days, pouring 6 years of suppressed expertise and carefully modulated truth into 4,000 words that would redefine careers and reputations. The essay was titled The Art of Authenticity, When Critical Support Becomes Creative Scaffolding, and it examined the ethical complexity of critics who privately support artists while maintaining public objectivity. She was scrupulously fair in the piece, didn't mention Marcus by name, but anyone in the art world would recognize the case study she described. An artist with solid technical skills but limited conceptual depth who'd received opportunities through a critic's invisible intervention, who'd built a career on scaffolding rather than foundation, who'd mistaken borrowed legitimacy for earned respect, whose work, when examined without the artificial elevation provided by critical support, revealed itself as competent but ultimately forgettable. The kind of art that decorates corporate lobbies but never challenges viewers or advances discourse. The column dissected the ethical implications. What responsibility did critics have when their private support created false markets? When their invisible intervention elevated artists beyond their actual merit? When their personal relationships contaminated their professional judgment? The questions were philosophical, but the implications were devastatingly practical. The profile and column published simultaneously on a Wednesday morning that would become infamous in art world circles. The cover of the Arts Review showed Margot in her studio, surrounded by books and screens and the tools of her critical trade. Her face finally visible after 12 years of anonymity. The headline read Katharina Voss revealed, the woman who shaped contemporary art from the shadows. The article detailed her background, her doctoral work that had revolutionized attribution methodology, her books published under her maiden name that had redefined critical theory, her 12 years writing the most influential column in contemporary art, her careful maintenance of anonymity to preserve objectivity and avoid the cult of personality that plagued critical discourse. And it revealed that Dr. Katharina Voss had recently discovered that her anonymity had been weaponized, that an artist in her personal life had benefited from her professional intervention while treating her with contempt, that she'd hidden her identity to protect someone's ego, and that protection had enabled systematic emotional abuse and professional exploitation. The article didn't name Marcus, but it didn't need to. The art world was small, incestuous. Within hours, people had connected the dots. Within hours of publication, the art world exploded with reactions. Social media filled with people reassessing exhibitions and artists, questioning which opportunities had been organic and which had been arranged by the now revealed critic. Gallery directors sent urgent emails seeking clarification about past recommendations. Museum curators demanded transparency about which acquisitions had been influenced by Voss's invisible hand. Artists who'd received positive Voss coverage suddenly found themselves defending their legitimacy. Collectors wondered if their investments had been based on authentic merit or critical manipulation. The entire structure of contemporary art evaluation seemed to tremble on unstable foundations. And Marcus's phone began ringing with calls from gallery directors, collectors, and curators. Not with congratulations, not with support, but with questions, concerns, and in several cases outright cancellations of planned opportunities. The Turner Contemporary Museum issued a statement, announcing the early closure of Marcus Whitmore's exhibition due to irregularities in the curatorial process. His catalog essay would be removed from their archives. His name added to their internal list of artists who'd achieved representation through non-meritocratic means. His gallery called professional and cold, suggesting that given recent revelations about the nature of his career advancement, perhaps it would be mutually beneficial to part ways. The termination was effective immediately. Collectors canceled studio visits. Residency programs sent rejection letters. Grant applications that had seemed promising suddenly went silent. The art world, having discovered that Marcus's career had been built on Katharina Voss's invisible scaffolding rather than genuine merit, collectively decided he was a cautionary tale rather than a talent worth cultivating. The same industry that had celebrated him months ago now quietly erased him from their collective consciousness. The way organisms reject foreign tissue that doesn't belong. Margot was in Harrison's office when Marcus finally tracked her down. He burst through the door without knocking, his face mottled with rage and something that looked like dawning horror. "What have you done?" His voice shook on every word. "What the hell have you done to me?" Harrison stood, positioned himself slightly between Margot and Marcus, ready to intervene if the confrontation became physical. But Margot touched his arm gently, indicating she could handle this, that she needed to handle this herself. "I stopped doing anything for you," Margot replied calmly, standing beside Harrison with the certainty of someone finally inhabiting her true identity. "I've stopped arranging opportunities you didn't earn. I've stopped protecting you from the reality of your limited talent. I've stopped making myself invisible so you could feel important. You're Katharina Voss," Marcus said, the words emerging like an accusation, like a betrayal. "This whole time you've been Katharina Voss and you never told me? You've been writing about artists, reviewing exhibitions, shaping the entire field I work in. And you let me think you were just some consultant? You let me dismiss you and treat you like you understood nothing when you were the most powerful critic in contemporary art? Yes, Margot confirmed. I let you think that because I loved you, because I believed that hiding my professional identity would protect your ego from feeling diminished. Because I was stupid enough to think that making myself small would make you love me better. Because I wanted to be loved for something other than my professional reputation. And you seemed to love the version of me that didn't threaten you. So I kept being that version, even as it slowly killed everything I'd built, even as it destroyed my sense of self. You've destroyed my career. Marcus's voice rose toward hysteria. The museum is closing my exhibition. My gallery dropped me. Collectors are canceling studio visits. Grant programs are rejecting applications they'd previously encouraged. Everything I've built is falling apart because of your vindictive revenge. Because you couldn't handle that I found someone who actually appreciates me. Everything you built was always mine. Margot interrupted, her voice sharp as surgical steel. Every opportunity, every exhibition, every door that opened, all of it came through my intervention, my reputation, my professional relationships that I leveraged on your behalf while you treated me like I understood nothing about art. You didn't build anything, Marcus. I built it for you. And now I've stopped building. And you're discovering what you actually are without my invisible support. Mediocre. The word landed like a physical blow. Marcus staggered backward slightly, his face cycling through rage and devastation and finally settling into something that looked like comprehension. Like he was finally seeing clearly for the first time in 6 years. You can't do this, he whispered. You can't just destroy someone's career because your marriage failed. Because you couldn't satisfy me emotionally or intellectually. Because I found connection with someone else. I didn't destroy your career. Margot replied. I removed my support from it. There's a difference. You're free now to succeed or fail based on your actual merit rather than borrowed legitimacy. Isn't that what every artist wants? To be judged on their true abilities. You should be thanking me, Marcus. Now you'll know if your work has genuine value or if it only mattered because my name was invisibly attached to it. I loved you, Marcus said finally, the words sounding hollow even to him. No, Margot corrected gently. You loved who you thought I was. You loved the version of me that made you feel superior and talented and important. You never loved the actual woman standing in front of you. Because you never bothered to learn who she actually was. In 6 years of marriage, you never asked about my work, my interests, my thoughts on anything beyond domestic arrangements and your career challenges. You were married to a reflection of your own ego, not to me. And when that reflection found someone who made him feel even more important, you didn't hesitate to betray the woman who'd built everything you had. Marcus looked at her with pure hatred burning in his eyes. But underneath it, she saw the first stirrings of understanding. That he'd never actually known who she was. That he'd been married to a stranger wearing a mask of compliance and support. That the woman standing before him now was someone he'd never bothered to discover during 6 years of cohabitation. He left Harrison's office without another word. And Margot watched him go with something that felt like grief mixed with relief. Mourning not the man he'd been, but the illusion she'd maintained about who they were together. After the door closed, Harrison turned to her. His weathered face carrying an expression she'd never quite seen before. A mixture of admiration and concern and something deeper. Something that looked like barely restrained emotion trying to break through professional boundaries. How do you feel? He asked quietly. Free. Margot replied. And terrified. And sad. And relieved. All of it at once. Is that normal? Completely. Harrison moved closer. Not quite touching but near enough that she could feel his warmth. His steady presence. You've just burned down a life you spent 6 years building. Even when that life was destroying you, even when leaving was necessary, grief is appropriate. You're allowed to mourn what you thought you had. Even if it was never real. They stood in silence for a long moment. The afternoon light golden through his office windows. And Margot felt something shift in the air between them. Some possibility that had always been present but constrained by the roles they'd played. Mentor and student, editor and writer, colleagues maintaining professional distance. Harrison, Margot began, but he raised a hand gently. Let me say this before I lose courage. His voice carried vulnerability she'd never heard before. I should have told you 6 years ago not to marry him. I should have been more forceful. Should have made you see that hiding yourself would destroy you piece by piece. But I didn't push harder because I was afraid. Afraid of what? Of revealing that my concern wasn't purely professional or paternal. Harrison met her eyes directly. Because I've been half in love with your brilliant mind for 15 years. And I didn't trust myself to push harder without crossing boundaries I had no right to cross. The admission settled between them like snow falling. Quiet, transformative, changing the landscape of everything they'd been to each other. Margot felt her breath catch. Not from shock but from recognition of something she'd perhaps always known but had never allowed herself to fully acknowledge. Harrison, she said again. But he continued. I'm not telling you this because I expect anything. You've just emerged from a marriage that destroyed your trust and your sense of self. The last thing you need is another man complicating your life or making demands. I'm telling you because I'm 72 years old, and I've learned that some truths deserve to be spoken even if they change nothing about practical reality. You should know that someone saw you, really saw you, even when you were hiding, even when you were making yourself invisible. I saw the brilliant, extraordinary woman you've always been. And I've loved her from a respectful distance for longer than I care to admit. What if I told you that I'm tired of hiding truths? Margot reached across the space between them, took his weathered hand in hers. That I spent 6 years pretending to be someone I wasn't. And I'm done with pretense in all its forms? Then I'd say you should take all the time you need to figure out who you are without defining yourself in relationship to someone else. Harrison replied, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her hand. And when you've done that work, if there's still space in your life for an old man who's loved your mind since you walked into his office as a graduate student, I'll be here. I'm patient. I've waited 15 years. I can wait a bit longer. I don't want to wait anymore. Margot said quietly, I spent 6 years of my life in a relationship where I was invisible. I'd like to spend whatever time we have in one where I'm fully seen. Harrison's face transformed with joy that made him look decades younger. Then we'll take this slowly. We'll take it at whatever pace feels right for you. There's no rush, no pressure, just possibility. They left it there that day. Truth spoken but not immediately acted upon. Possibility acknowledged but not rushed. And over the following months, Margot did exactly what Harrison suggested. She figured out who she was without defining herself through relationship to anyone else. The divorce proceedings moved forward with clinical efficiency. Margot's lawyer was ruthless and thorough. The asset disclosure meeting revealed the extent of her hidden wealth to Marcus's attorney. Property holdings Marcus had never known existed. Investment accounts she'd maintained separately throughout their marriage. Intellectual property rights to books and essays that had generated substantial royalties over the years. A financial position that dwarfed anything Marcus had ever imagined. My client was unaware of the extent of Dr. Rivera's holdings. Marcus's lawyer said carefully, trying to maintain professional composure while visibly shocked. This significantly changes our understanding of the marital estate and division of assets. Your client was unaware because he never asked. Margot's lawyer replied with barely concealed disdain. Dr. Rivera maintained her professional identity and earnings separately throughout the marriage. Mr. Whitmore benefited extensively from her professional connections and support, but the actual revenue from her work remained entirely independent of their joint finances. He has no legal claim to assets he never knew existed and never contributed to acquiring. The settlement was straightforward. Margot kept everything that had always been hers, which was nearly everything of value. Marcus left with his art supplies, his paintings, and the sobering reality of who he was without borrowed legitimacy. But the most devastating blow to Marcus's ego didn't come from professional consequences or financial reality. It came from Sienna herself, who broke off their relationship within weeks of Margot's identity being revealed. Harrison told Margot about this development with something close to grim satisfaction during one of their now daily coffee meetings. Apparently young Ms. Castellanos was less interested in Marcus the mediocre artist and more interested in Marcus the museum exhibited, gallery-represented professional who seemed like he could elevate her own career. Once his credentials evaporated, so did her affection. She's apparently now dating a curator at MoMA. Someone who can actually help her career rather than damage it through association. Margot felt nothing at this news. No vindication. No satisfaction. Just acknowledgement that some people loved the appearance of success rather than the human beneath it. And that Marcus had finally experienced what he'd put her through for years. Being valued only for what you could provide rather than who you actually were. Meanwhile, Margot's professional life exploded in directions she'd never anticipated. The Arts Review profile generated more attention than anything in the magazine's 70-year history. Her books, previously published under her maiden name and read primarily by academics, suddenly appeared on bestseller lists as general readers discovered the depth of her critical work. Universities offered her prestigious positions. Museums invited her to curate major exhibitions. Publishers competed for her next book contract with advances that made her already substantial wealth seem modest. The art world, having discovered that their anonymous oracle had a face and a history, wanted to celebrate her, to claim proximity to her influence, to bask in reflected glory of having been shaped by her invisible hand. But Margot was careful about which opportunities she accepted. Selective about maintaining the integrity that had made her criticism valuable in the first place. She agreed to a distinguished scholar position at Harrison's University, a role that required only monthly lectures and gave her freedom to continue writing without administrative burden. She accepted an invitation to curate a traveling exhibition on authenticity and attribution in contemporary art, seeing an opportunity to explore themes that had defined her career and her personal devastation. And she started painting again, returning to the creative practice she'd abandoned when she'd married Marcus and convinced herself that supporting his art was sufficient creative outlet for both of them. Her work explored identity and visibility and the violence of erasure. Large canvases showing figures emerging from shadow into light. Half-hidden faces revealing themselves. The liminal space between invisibility and presence. Critics praised the emotional depth, the technical sophistication, the way her theoretical understanding of art translated into visceral visual impact. Her first solo exhibition, held under her own name rather than any pseudonym, was a critical success that felt earned rather than arranged. Validation of her creative vision rather than her critical reputation. Standing in the gallery surrounded by her own work, celebrated for her own artistic merit, Margot felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Pride without qualification. Success without the bitter taste of knowing it was borrowed or stolen or built on someone else's invisible labor. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own life differently, I need you to do something. Drop a comment telling me your biggest takeaway. Hit that like button if you believe women should never have to hide their power. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, because we're about to see what Margot's life becomes when she finally stops hiding. And it's going to show you what's possible when you choose yourself. The healing happens slowly, like broken bones knitting back together with patience and proper care. Margot had spent 6 years making herself invisible. And becoming visible again required relearning how to occupy space without apologizing for her presence. How to voice opinions without softening their edges. How to be fully herself without diminishing that self to protect someone else's fragile ego. Harrison was there through all of it, steady as a lighthouse in storms that seemed endless. Their relationship evolved naturally, professional collaboration deepening into genuine friendship, friendship opening into possibility. They worked together during the days, managing her speaking engagements and curatorial projects, discussing her writing and his editorial insights, the partnership they'd always had expanding to include more personal dimensions. In the evenings they talked for hours, about art and theory and the nature of identity, about their pasts and their regrets and their hopes for whatever future remained, about books and music and the small details of daily life that Marcus had never bothered to ask about. Harrison was genuinely interested in her thoughts, her perspectives, her experiences. He asked questions and listened to answers, challenged her ideas without dismissing them, disagreed without belittling, supported without suffocating. It was what partnership was supposed to feel like. Margot realized mutual respect rather than competitive hierarchy, celebration rather than resentment, visibility rather than erasure. One evening, sitting on the balcony of her penthouse with the city glittering below like scattered jewels, Harrison reached across the small table between them, took her hand with gentle hesitation, as if asking permission for something significant. "I know it's too soon," he said quietly. "I know you're still healing from everything. But Margot, I've waited over 20 years to ask if you might consider giving us a chance at something more than partnership and friendship. I'm not asking for an answer tonight, just asking if you'd think about the possibility. If you'd consider whether there might be space in your life for someone who sees you, all of you, and loves what he sees." Margot felt tears building, but not from sadness this time. "I don't need time to think about it," she replied. "You've been the most consistent person in my life through everything. You've seen me at my worst and stayed. You've protected me without asking for anything in return. You've celebrated my success without feeling threatened by it. If you're asking if I'm ready to see where this could go, then yes, Harrison, I think I am." He smiled with relief and joy mixed together beautifully, standing and pulling her gently to her feet, holding her close while the city sparkled around them like a celebration designed just for this moment. It felt like coming home after being lost for years in wilderness, finding safe harbor with someone who'd been waiting patiently for her to arrive when she was ready. Their relationship developed with the ease of people who'd known each other across decades, who'd weathered professional challenges and personal disasters together, who'd built trust through years of consistent support rather than romantic performance. Harrison loved her brilliant mind, yes, but he also loved her sharp humor, her occasional self-doubt, her messy humanity beneath the critical brilliance. He encouraged her creative work without trying to claim credit or insert himself into her process. He celebrated her professional triumphs without feeling threatened by her success. He created space for her to be fully herself, complex, contradictory, brilliant, flawed, visible, without requiring her to diminish any part of herself to protect his ego. A year after her divorce was finalized, Margot appeared at Harrison's office without appointment, carrying coffee and a question she'd been considering for months. "Are you still interested in that space in your life?" she asked without preamble. "Because I think I've figured out who I am, and that person would very much like to explore what we could be together." Harrison's face transformed with joy that erased decades from his weathered features. "I've been waiting for you to arrive at that conclusion for approximately 15 years. I'm patient. I can wait a bit longer if you need more time." "I don't want to wait anymore," Margot replied. "I spent 6 years of my life in a relationship where I was invisible. I'd like to spend whatever time we have in one where I'm fully seen." They married 2 years after her divorce, in a garden overlooking the ocean, a small intimate gathering of people who genuinely loved them both. No spectacle, no performance, just truth and commitment and the kind of joy that comes from genuine partnership between equals. The ceremony was simple but profound. Vows spoken with the weight of decades of friendship behind them, giving depth to every promise. Harrison's voice trembled slightly when he promised to stand beside her as an equal partner always, to celebrate her strength rather than fear it, to love her exactly as she was rather than trying to reshape her into something smaller and more manageable for his ego. Margot spoke her own vows with clarity that came from hard-won wisdom purchased through pain. She promised honesty and genuine partnership, and the courage to remain fully visible even when it would be easier to hide parts of herself again. When they kissed to seal their marriage, the small group of guests applauded with genuine joy, and Margot felt happiness bloom inside her chest, untainted by doubt or fear or the need to diminish herself for someone else's comfort or insecurity. This was what marriage was supposed to feel like. What partnership could be when both people respected each other completely without reservation. Marcus's reckoning came slowly. like dawn breaking over landscapes that had been dark for so long that inhabitants forgot what light looked like. His career never recovered. Not because Margot continued any active campaign against him, but because the art world's collective memory was long and unforgiving, especially toward artists who'd been revealed as having achieved representation through connections rather than merit. He moved to a smaller city, took a teaching position at a community college where his museum exhibition still carried some weight even if the circumstances were quietly understood by those who bothered to research. He taught painting to students who would mostly never pursue art professionally, and he approached the work with more honesty than he'd brought to anything in his previous life. His students loved him, appreciated his technical instruction and his willingness to critique their work with genuine attention. But Marcus knew the truth. He was teaching because he couldn't succeed as a practicing artist, was passing on skills he'd never mastered conceptually, was living a diminished life that felt like punishment for sins he'd taken years to fully acknowledge. The full understanding came to him one evening while sitting in his small apartment, scrolling through articles about Margot's continued success. She'd just published her third book, had curated an exhibition at the Guggenheim that critics called revelatory, had been named one of the most influential thinkers in contemporary art by multiple publications. Her face appeared in magazines and journals. Her opinions shaped discourse. Her visibility seemed to grow exponentially with each passing year. And Marcus realized with devastating clarity that he'd been married to one of the most brilliant minds of their generation. And he'd treated her like she understood nothing, like she was decorative rather than essential, like her value came from supporting him rather than from her own extraordinary capabilities. He pulled out old photographs from their marriage, looked at images of Margot standing in corners at his exhibitions, smiling pleasantly while he accepted congratulations for opportunities she'd arranged. In picture after picture, he could now see what he'd been blind to in real time, the light slowly dying in her eyes, the way her smile became more practiced and less genuine, the visible diminishment of someone making themselves smaller with each passing month. He'd destroyed something precious through casual cruelty and willful ignorance, and the weight of that understanding sat on his chest like stones that made breathing difficult. Marcus wrote her a letter, not seeking forgiveness because he understood he deserved none, but simply acknowledging what he'd done, who she'd been, who he'd failed to see. He wrote about his regrets, his growing understanding of the violence he'd committed through dismissal and erasure, his recognition that he'd been given a gift and had crushed it deliberately. He sent the letter to her publisher, knowing she'd likely never read it, that she'd moved so far beyond the life they'd shared that his remorse would mean nothing in the context of her continued evolution. And he'd been right. The letter was returned unopened weeks later. Margot's assistant's note attached. Dr. Rivera does not wish to engage in correspondence regarding her previous marriage. The finality of that rejection was appropriate and devastating in equal measure. Marcus kept the unopened letter in his desk drawer, a physical reminder of opportunities lost and damage that could never be repaired. He never remarried, dated occasionally but found that relationships felt hollow when built on honesty about his mediocrity rather than pretense about his brilliance. He lived a quiet life of genuine teaching and modest painting, creating work that would never be museum quality but was honestly executed rather than propped up by borrowed legitimacy. And sometimes, late at night, he looked at images of Margot's success and felt grief for the man he could have been. If he'd been brave enough to see her fully, if he'd loved her brilliance rather than resented it, if he'd chosen partnership over ego protection. But those thoughts changed nothing about practical reality. He'd made his choices, and now he lived with their consequences, carrying the weight of understanding exactly what he'd destroyed, and knowing that no amount of remorse could resurrect what he'd killed through systematic cruelty and willful blindness. 5 years after her divorce, Margot stood in her studio overlooking the city, watching dawn paint the skyline in shades of gold and rose that made everything look possible. The canvas before her was nearly finished, a self-portrait that showed her face emerging from shadows, half hidden and half revealed, exploring the liminal space between invisibility and visibility that had defined so much of her life. Harrison appeared in the doorway carrying coffee. His presence as comfortable and essential as breathing after 5 years of partnership that had proven everything she'd been denied in her marriage. "Still working?" he asked with gentle concern. "You've been up all night." "Finishing," Margot replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "I wanted to capture that exact moment of transition, when you stop hiding and start inhabiting your full self. It's harder than I expected to translate into visual language." Harrison studied the canvas with the same serious attention he'd brought to her dissertation 15 years ago. "It's extraordinary," he said finally, "vulnerable and powerful simultaneously. This might be the best work you've ever created." "Coming from Katerina Voss's editor, that means something," Margot replied with a smile. "Coming from your husband, it means more," Harrison corrected, pulling her close. Margot's career had continued evolving in directions she'd never anticipated when she first decided to reveal her identity. Her critical work remained influential, shaping conversations and directing resources toward deserving artists. But her creative practice had become equally significant. A second career that existed alongside rather than subordinate to her critical reputation. She'd published books that bridged academic theory and accessible prose, had curated exhibitions that challenged viewers' assumptions about authenticity and value, had mentored young scholars and artists with the kind of support that elevated rather than eclipsed, that celebrated their talents without requiring them to diminish themselves or credit her publicly. And she'd used her platform deliberately to address issues she understood intimately. The invisible labor women performed in creative partnerships. The violence of erasure that happened in marriages where one person's success required another's diminishment. The particular courage required to become visible after years of hiding. Her memoir had spawned a movement of sorts. Women sharing stories of making themselves small, of hiding their brilliance to protect fragile male egos, of the cost of invisibility and the power of reclaiming space. Margot received thousands of messages from women who recognized their own experiences in her story, who'd found courage to stop accepting unacceptable treatment, who'd walked away from relationships that required self-annihilation. She'd become, accidentally, a voice for a particular kind of transformation. The journey from invisible to visible, from diminished to whole, from someone defined by relationship to someone inhabiting full identity regardless of who was watching. One afternoon, while delivering a lecture at the university, Margot noticed a familiar face in the back row. Marcus, looking older and smaller than she remembered, sat taking notes like any other student. Their eyes met briefly, and she saw in his face something that looked like genuine understanding of what he'd lost and who she'd always been. After the lecture, he approached her carefully, maintaining respectful distance, not presuming access or intimacy he'd forfeited years ago. "I don't expect anything," he said quietly. "I just wanted to hear you speak in your own voice, using your full expertise, being completely visible. I never got to see that when we were married. It seemed important to witness it now, even if only as a stranger in an audience." Margot studied him for a long moment, seeing not the man who'd hurt her but simply a human who'd made catastrophic choices and was living with their consequences. "I hope you're doing well, Marcus," she said simply. "I genuinely mean that. I'm doing honestly," he replied, "which is the best I can manage given what I destroyed. Thank you for the lecture. It was brilliant, truly brilliant." He left without asking for more, and Margot watched him go with something close to peace, understanding that some chapters closed completely while others left questions that would never be answered. And either way, she'd moved forward, built a life so full and rich and authentically hers that the past had no power to diminish her present. That evening she told Harrison about the encounter, and he listened with the careful attention that characterized his love for her. "How did it feel?" he asked. "Seeing him again after all these years? Like looking at someone I used to know a long time ago." Margot replied, "Not painful, not satisfying, just complete. That part of my life is finished, and I feel no need to revisit it beyond acknowledging that it happened and I survived it." "You did more than survive," Harrison corrected gently. "You transformed." You took devastation and rebuilt yourself into something more powerful than you were before. We transformed. Margot kissed him, grateful for partnership that celebrated rather than diminished, that encouraged visibility rather than requiring erasure. This isn't a solo journey anymore. Now, standing in her studio with her self-portrait nearly complete and her life fully inhabited, Margot felt something she'd been denied for too many years. Absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do, being exactly who she was meant to be. The tracker she'd planted in Marcus's bag had revealed the truth about his betrayal. Yes, but more importantly, it had forced her to confront the truth about her own self-betrayal, about the violence she'd committed against herself by hiding her brilliance, by making herself invisible, by accepting treatment that required her own erasure. The discovery had broken her marriage, yes, but it had also broken the prison she'd built around her own identity, the chains she'd worn by choice, the diminishment she'd accepted as the price of being loved. And what emerged from that breaking was a woman fully visible, fully powerful, fully herself, not despite the pain she'd survived but because of it. Because she'd taken devastation and transformed it into wisdom, taken betrayal and rebuilt it into boundaries, taken invisibility and claimed space that belonged to her. Harrison appeared beside her again, slipping an arm around her waist. The painting is finished, he observed. What comes next? Margot smiled, looking at the canvas that showed her face emerging from shadow into light. The exact moment of transformation captured in oil and brushwork and hard-won understanding. Everything, she said simply, everything comes next. And she meant it. The world was wide and full of possibility. And she was finally visible enough to see it clearly, powerful enough to shape it, whole enough to inhabit it fully without apology or diminishment. She'd planted the tracker to find the truth. What she'd uncovered had broken more than just her marriage. It had broken every limitation she'd accepted, every lie she'd believed about needing to hide her light to be loved, every compromise she'd made with her own brilliance. And from that breaking, she'd built something extraordinary, a life fully lived, a self fully inhabited, a visibility that blazed like fire and warmed everything it touched. The empire had always been hers. She'd just forgotten for a while, had let someone else convince her that power meant hiding rather than shining. But she remembered now, and she would never forget again. My story isn't just about a cheating husband or a hidden identity. Margot turned to face you directly now, breaking through the narrative to speak truth. It's about what happens when we make ourselves small to protect someone else's ego. It's about the price of invisibility and the power of reclaiming space that always belonged to us. The tracker revealed Marcus's betrayal, but more importantly, it revealed my own self-betrayal. Every day I pretended to be less than I was lying to both of us. And those lies built a marriage that could only survive as long as I stayed invisible. Some of you watching this are living your own version of invisibility right now. You're hiding your intelligence, your success, your power, because you're afraid it will threaten someone you love. Let me tell you what I learned the hard way. If your light threatens them, they never loved you. They loved the dimmed version that made them feel superior. True love celebrates your brilliance. True partnership elevates both people. True respect means you never have to hide who you are. The woman who was made invisible became the woman who could not be unseen. And that transformation didn't happen because someone gave her permission. It happened because she finally gave herself permission to stop accepting anything less than she deserved. You don't need permission to be fully yourself. You just need the courage to stop accepting anything less. If this story moved you, if it changed how you see your own life, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment with your biggest takeaway. What moment hit you hardest? What truth are you going to stop hiding? Hit that like button if you believe women should never have to make themselves small. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who's been hiding. Someone who's been making excuses for being treated as invisible. And subscribe to Love Stories with Dr. Stone. Because every week we're telling stories that don't just entertain. They transform how you see love and power and yourself. Remember this. You were never meant to be small. You were meant to be exactly who you are. Fully visible, fully powerful, fully yourself. The empire was always yours. Don't let anyone make you forget it. I'm Dr. Stone, and I'll see you in the next story.